Open Market is sponsored by AdLib, the self-serve DSP solution making advertising easy. What do the world's largest demand-side platforms have in common? They're effective, but they require large annual contracts and spend minimums. With AdLib, growing agencies get a single platform that connects to every top global DSP with no contracts, no spend minimums, and G2's #1 ranked support. That means access to the entire universe of TV, digital out-of-home, audio, display, video, and native without a hassle and with no blind spots. It's incredibly easy to use, plus it can automate most of the work your team spends hours a day doing manually. Get the most powerful media buying technology without the barriers to entry. Check out AdLib at getadlib.com today.
Welcome to Open Market, a podcast about building companies in the advertising industry. I'm Joe Zappa, and I'm joined by Eric Franchi and special guest, Ryan Pauley, who is president of revenue and growth at Vox Media. How's it going, Eric and Ryan?
Hey,
what's up?
Everything's good.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks, guys. I'm a fan of the first handful of episodes, so I'm honored to be here.
Thank you. And for those who question the value of Cannes, this happened because Ryan and I ran into each other during the day. I think actually it was in the morning at the Carlton Hotel. So these serendipitous run-ins that people talk about that if you've never been there, you sort of kind of scratch your head. They lead to outcomes. Sometimes those outcomes are podcast guests. So thank you, Ryan, for doing this.
Absolutely.
So you're saying you guys weren't even 7 shots deep when you decided to do this?
Maybe even not through my second coffee. So it wasn't, yeah.
How many shots did you do in Cannes? Or how many glasses of rosé did you have? Be honest, Ryan.
There's a lot of glasses of rosé, all responsibly, but it just flows a little differently. It's basically it's more or less you just swap the seltzer that I drink here for rosé. It goes down a little bit.
All right. Ryan does work for a serious corporation, so he can't admit to being shit-faced on work time. Eric, on the other hand, does not. So Eric can cop to however drunk he was at various interactions in Cannes.
I was all business all the time, as always.
Eric says, I'm a respectable family man. I don't do that anymore.
All business. Hey, so Ryan, for those who are not familiar with you and perhaps for those who are not familiar with Vox and particularly the trajectory of Vox from, what we might have sort of originally, seen it as to what it is today with this focus on the conversation we're going to have around audio. Maybe give us a couple minutes about you, your role, and ultimately the state of Vox.
Absolutely. So as Joe mentioned, I oversee revenue and growth here at Vox, and I've been with the company for over 13 years now. The company's about 14, 15 years old. The company started as just SB Nation, a sort of very classic Web 2.0 digital media startup that was founded on sort of individual sports communities, underserved sports fans that were out of market from, the team that they cared about. And so that was the first sort of origination of the company. And we've grown a lot over the last 12 to 14 years through organic means and inorganic means. But sort of my background is I sort of came up through the strategy and operations side of the house. Most of my peers, I think, have sort of more traditional sales backgrounds, but I came sort of, it was a 40-person company when I started. So there were no real job roles or titles, but handled everything from programmatic to ad ops to yield, sort of launched our programmatic business and started sort of overseeing more of the organization. Then in 2016, we launched an ad technology business called Concert, which is a premium marketplace that I oversaw the launch of that and have been in this position overseeing sort of all revenue, sales and marketing and events and all the functions that go into that for the last 4+ years. So that's my background. But I know one of the things we wanted to focus on was around audio. And we've become, the way that we think about Vox Media today is it's a modern media company. We were born out of this digital age, but I think have executed really well to become a really prominent, just drop the digital, just media company. And we think about it into sort of 2 buckets. One is our premium publications. We operate 18 brands from SB Nation. As I mentioned, we started The Verge, which focuses on technology, Polygon on gaming, New York Magazine, Vox.com, which is focused on sort of news and politics and lifestyle, and a handful of others. So premium publications. Then the second arm, which is newer, is this focus on talent, which is where our audio business full. So we were in podcast early. We were about first podcast was Kara Swisher's podcast, Recode Decode, actually, which was about 8 or 9 years ago now at this point. And she was the driving force behind it, as she is with almost anything that she does. She came to us and was like, I want to start a podcast. Or like, it was early. There wasn't really a sort of obvious path forward. But one of the lessons that people take from this is you sort of find great talent and trust the talent, particularly in an audio medium form. And so we were in the business early and have grown through launching our own shows and bringing in outside talent, which I'm sure we'll get through. But now we're a top 10 podcast publisher really reliably. That's in sort of in that list is the big platforms like a Spotify and an iHeart, as well as the, only a handful of really big premium producers of podcasts like New York Times and Barstool has done it in a different way. So there's not too many at the sort of scale that we're operating at now.
So when I think of companies that have been really successful in audio, like Vox Media definitely comes to mind, The Ringer comes to mind, obviously the New York Times now does a lot of audio. What do you think positions a publisher to succeed in audio specifically?
Yeah, I think you have to have sort of the brand relevance that can kind of translate into a different medium. And so that's one. And the second part is certainly related to the ability to attract and support talent that can be very successful in the audio form. It's not a one-for-one translation of a great writer or even a great video talent can operate or produce a really strong podcast. That it's just a very different sort of lean back type of experience, a different type of skill set, and a different type of work, I would say. And so you have to really commit to it. There's been a lot of publishers that I think saw a little bit of the growth that wanted to dip a toe in, but couldn't quite find any product market fit. And that because it is really hard. It's still a relatively small market, I would say, from a commercial standpoint compared to other sort of advertising mediums. But if you're a publisher, and particularly in today's age where publishers need to prioritize loyalty, engagement, direct connections with audiences, podcasts are one of the mediums that sort of really over-index on depth of engagement and loyalty between audience and the host or the brand that's producing it.
Right. I'm sorry to go like kind of geeky and tactical, but you mentioned market size with respect to the podcast market. I think it's like, I keep hearing it's like a $2 billion market, and it's been a $2 billion market for a couple of years. I have this like thesis that the podcast market is actually much bigger than that, maybe in actuality, maybe potentially, because so many podcasts are now like video podcasts, right? And you can like watch them on YouTube, and there's a burgeoning marketplace there. It might be like connected to not just online video but CTV. Do you think about it in that way in terms of like the ad opportunity around audio?
100%. We are now shifting a lot of focus to take the content that's being produced in podcast form and expanding it to video and social platforms, because you can get a big distribution. Originally, one of the drivers of doing that was marketing for the shows and marketing for the podcast primarily. Now that is definitely shifting into direct monetization opportunities as well. Brands and our advertising partners see that opportunity as well. So I agree with you. There's definitely a bigger market than how it's sort of narrowly defined in the $2 billion number that's quoted, but it's certainly a lot bigger opportunity. And I think is a big part of the growing consumption patterns on the social platforms where, audiences and consumers are, much more engaged with the, influencer, creator, capital T talent type of content that is flooding more and more of individuals' feeds.
You mentioned, Ryan, that talent is really critical for podcasts, and that resonates with my experience. I think as soon as I started listening to podcasts, and Kara Swisher is a great example, I had a very deep relationship with the individuals creating the content. Whereas when I started becoming a media consumer, I would just go to like the New York Times homepage, and occasionally I would recognize a byline, but it wasn't that important to me. With that said, how do you get into audio in the beginning then? Like, is it much more important than for starting like a print or, just a digital publication to go out and acquire a big name? Like, do you need that to sort of get started and then to build an advantage once you already have some talent? How do you think about that?
Yes, I think that's a part of it. It's certainly a lot harder now which you all would know, and are doing a great job of this with the new show. But it's certainly a lot harder now to launch a new podcast and attract a big audience. It was, I would say, easier, still very hard, but it was easier 8 years ago when we started, when it was much more of a up and coming medium with a lot of people flocking to it. It feels now, I think the number is most consumers end up spending time with somewhere between 2 and 3 individual shows. They are likely subscribed to a lot more on a regular basis. It's somewhere between 2 and 5 shows that people listen to regularly. So cracking into that, top 5 is certainly a challenge. A couple of the ways you can do that. One is go really deep on a niche topic, what you guys are doing here, and attracting, reaching an audience that is in tune and looking for that type of content. 2 is a talent that can attract the audience themselves, which is sort of the approach that we took mostly. And 3 is experimenting with different formats. I think there's still a lot of opportunity with new, interesting sort of audio formats that aren't what most shows are today, which is like somewhere between a 30 and 60 minute just sort of chat or interview with people. So I think sort of the format, talent, and topic are the 3 areas that are still lots of room to go on sort of launching new shows, new podcasts, new sort of talent opportunities.
Yeah, for me, the ability to go super deep on a niche is possibly the coolest thing about podcasts. And as a business person, I actually frequently wish there were more niche podcasts. I mean, obviously, so that's part of why we started this for advertising people. But for example, as a marketing agency owner, like there is agency content out there, but I honestly wish there were more podcasts that were dedicated to specific parts of like building an agency business, because you'll get stuff like there are podcasts about, selling an agency, or maybe there are podcasts about growing it, but it's from people who don't actually have that much experience. There are a lot of different angles to that kind of thing. And so I think that's a cool part of it. Another thing that, as someone who is trained in journalism, I find very interesting is that podcasts are much less tied to news cycles, I find, than digital. So like, you learn as a journalist, it's like basically by the next day, it's old news and it doesn't matter. You can't really write about it anymore unless you're doing some sort of like super deep dive. But whether it's about entertainment or politics, I'll listen to like 5 different podcasts about the same show or the same political development. We're recording the night after the presidential debate. I listened to 3 podcasts on that already, and I guarantee you I'll listen to more even several days later because I'm a masochist like that. So I don't know. How do you think about that and like taking advantage of all those opportunities within audio versus other media?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We see that in the data where the back catalog does actually quite well from a consumption standpoint. And like sort of a week after the original episode is published, still sees a reasonable amount of audience attention. And I do that. I experience that in my own behavior. There was, I guess last month, there was a big article in the Wall Street Journal about the Acquired podcast, which is maybe like exhibit A of go super deep on a topic. And their Microsoft, like part 1 of the Microsoft deep dive was like a 4-hour podcast, and you listen to it in a few settings, but that's a good example of letting people go super deep, and that will remain relevant for a very, very long time. And we think about that in the way that we build the sort of podcast network to make sure that there's some staying power. Shows like last year we brought on Esther Perel's show, Where Should We Begin? Who's like very renowned psychotherapist, and her content is very, very evergreen in that way, so that when someone new comes to the show, experiences her for the first time, they can go very deep. It is a medium that puts more control, I would say, in the audience's hands to sort of spend the time and go down the rabbit holes they want to.
Ryan, a couple of episodes ago, we did something. The title was like, what if your market is not big enough? Effectively, it was about how do you find, the next market to, either pivot into or transition the business into. And what I'd be interested in learning a little bit about from you, especially since you've been there through, basically the beginning, what was it like to go from a leader in like display and video advertising and like, a text and, video based media format to like jumping on audio? And like, how was that evolution, both in terms of like the content, the culture, and then ultimately like advertising sales? I know it's a big question, so you don't need to go, super deep or super long on it, but like we're kind of fascinated with this, again, given that this is a GTM podcast. And you're a big example of like pulling it off right in a very unique way. So I think there's probably some learnings for everybody, if you can walk through it.
Absolutely. Well, it's kind of funny. There's some pros and there's some cons to approaching it and entering a new market, especially one that is small but still growing. And the positives of it is as you noted, we were competing in display market, in video market, in branded content, and a few other places. And those markets are dominated by the biggest companies in the whole world. And so you're like scratching, clawing to pick off really small pieces of this big market. And we were doing well and we continue to do well and we've grown since then. But with podcasts, we're enter a market where we could be a material part of the market share. And so even though it's small, if you get in early and you can be big enough and good enough, you have more sway over the market. You can sort of move the market a little bit. We are a attraction for talent now, like really big name talent. As I mentioned, we brought on Esther Perel last year. Brene Brown's podcast is part of the podcast network. Just last week in Cannes, we announced that Megan Rapinoe and Sue Bird were going to bring their show into the Vox Media podcast network. So we've really built a place that supports and amplifies talent and their content and the monetization opportunity. And so you can only build that if you're in early and you go through the trial and error of getting it wrong, getting it right. But the other element I would say, which I think is relevant to anyone listening, is because it was small, and anytime you start something new inside of a like reasonably established company, we had to sort of peel off people and create a really small like pod that was 100% dedicated, focused to this part of the business, because it was never going to reach the level of priority of people that were supporting the other businesses or other brands where we could actually get through that sort of iterative cycles that we needed to that early in the process. So we did have to take a bit of a leap of faith and put, a small skunkworks team that was 100% dedicated to the podcast business.
How was it selling your first like podcast deals? Do you remember? Were you involved?
It was fun. We took a slightly different approach, which is, I think, worked in our favor. It made it a little harder out of the gate, but even still today, the split in podcast advertising between the direct response and the brand market is, I think on average, it's sort of 2/3 direct response and 1/3 brand advertising. And direct response is the Athletic Greens reads and the Bombas socks. And, early on, it was like Quip toothbrush. That was one of our earlier deals that we did. And our business has now for quite a long time been the inverse of that, where 2/3 of our podcast business is like big Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 brand advertising and 1/3 direct response. And that's actually served us well because we sort of make our bones on premium content, high quality creative formats, and things like that. And so that's where we separated ourselves both around the content and the talent and the shows, but also around our ability to kind of shepherd big brands into audio and podcast advertising, in many times for like the first time that their brand was entering into that medium. And so very experimental budget, lots of eyes and attention on it, even though it wasn't that much money, which was fun for us, but it made for, a more challenging go-to-market there for the first year or two.
How do you think about the different ways you can monetize podcasts? So obviously the standard everyone would think of is like a, pre-roll ad where it's recorded in advance. That's familiar to us. But you can also like build an audience via podcasts and then monetize it via events. I imagine there are possibilities with sponsored content. Sometimes there are organic relationships between creators and companies where they might shout them out, and that's its own form of publicity. How do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are all the ways that you mentioned. We've done everything from the podcast host reads. We have a small creative team that produces what we call branded reads that may not be the host, but we've done branded segments. You do branded series. Just recently with Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway on the Pivot podcast, we did a few episodes on the future of travel. That Version Atlantic was a a partner for. And so that's a topic that they care about, that matters a lot, and sort of organically comes through in the show, but we could do a few dedicated episodes to it. Those are kind of the natural extensions of it today. But as we look ahead, the even bigger opportunity is some of what we talked about earlier of expanding into video and social platforms, doing much more live event opportunities and experiential opportunities. A handful of years ago, acquired Criminal, a big sort of true crime podcast. They did their first live tour last year, 13 stops across the country, sold out, nearly 1,000 seats a pop in each one very, very quickly. And so there's a lot of extension opportunities between IRL and video and social.
You mentioned the ad tech business before, Ryan. Could you tell us more about the state of that?
It's developing, I would say. It's certainly much more mature than it was 5+ years ago. And I think Spotify has actually done a really good job of maturing that part of the market. I'll say the measurement has gotten a lot better. The consistent constraint of brands investing more, and still has a long way to go, certainly to compare to the bigger advertising mediums like display and platforms and CTV and things like that. But it is much better. I would say generally, though, as we mentioned, it's still mostly in this couple $1 billion market. If I was a betting man, I would say once you start to get closer to the 10 billion plus market threshold, that's where you kind of graduate out of the experimental part of the budget, and you really have to show pretty direct attribution on the return. And so that's kind of where when we talk to brands and we talk to tech partners, as we sort of forecast out, that's where I think the real development will need to happen as the market continues to grow.
How does this market go from 2 to 10?
I think a lot of what we've talked about of this expansion across platforms, I do think we're going to, in maybe 2 to 3 years, it's going to become obvious, and we will talk about this business probably more like, we talk about podcast, which is the medium, but the shows and the talent and the franchises, and it just becomes a really strong IP generation exercise, and sort of having these shows that exist both in audio form, but also in video form, and come to life in experiential forms. And that's where I think the opportunity comes from, as well as this real brands becoming much more comfortable with the measurement and the attribution that exists today. There is an incredible amount of engagement that comes through in podcasts. I think anyone you talk to that listens to podcasts or reinforces the connection that they have to the show, to the host, the time that people listen to and spend with the content is always very, very high. And so as brands think about investing in the mid to upper funnel part of the marketing funnel, podcasts are going to grow as a portion of that budget that gets invested, particularly as TV continues to come down and reach is already kind of commoditized, but will continue to do so. And so how do you build real relationships and real engagement that creates long-lasting impact? Like podcasts and this type of connection to the talent is one area that I think is going to grow materially as part of a brand's marketing mix.
I think that makes a ton of sense. Just anecdotally coming out of Cannes, so many people stopped me, just wanted to talk about the pod, wanted to talk about this pod, I wanted to talk about the Marketecture Weekly. That doesn't come through in like the number of downloads, where it's like, this is a weekly habit for some people. This is like how they, get themselves on an exercise bike on Friday morning, because they know, all right, well, I'll have something interesting to listen to. And, that connected to what is, the dominant like monetization mechanism, which is like host read, sometimes with a unique code or a unique URL. It just feels like there's something that's going to break here, where the value of being in people's ears, regularly, and the level of influence and engagement has got to justify like a completely different way of thinking about this as a marketing, medium. And I know it's a bit of a ramble, but hopefully that makes sense.
Personally, I think of it like a content funnel. I mean, so like I create content on Twitter and LinkedIn. I have a newsletter and I have this podcast. And, the highest number of people who are going to engage with me are on social. And then down from there, it's the newsletter, and then it's the podcast, because this is like the most work for someone to get here and stay here. But the depth of the engagement when people are listening to you on a podcast is very high. If I listen to someone talk for, in 30 minutes a week for 4 weeks in a row, like I know a lot about them and how they think about problems and what's going on in the industry and so on in a way that I could engage with someone on Twitter for, it might take a year of engaging with them on Twitter to have the same level of relationship with them. So Ryan, from the publisher side, how do you think about that in terms of monetizing these channels? Like I imagine podcast ads, for example, are going to come at a premium for that reason. But how do you think about it?
Yes, that's the way that it manifests itself is today, at least, is in a very premium CPM based on the audience size. It also manifests itself in sort of larger investment opportunities around building programs and campaigns around the talent and around the show that brands are becoming more comfortable with the extensions outside of just the audio feed. Kara and Scott talk about this a lot, and they are both like really big names, and they've written books and they appear regularly on CNN and on TV. And then they have their podcast, and they know, they can tell very quickly when someone comes up to them how they recognize them. If they recognize them from seeing them on TV, it's sort of in this voyeuristic kind of peering around the corner, I'm afraid to go up to you sort of attention. If they know them from like their written work, it's a much more like appreciative relationship. I would say like they're thanking them for their work kind of thing. And if they recognize them through the podcast, they come up to them as if they've been friends for a decade. Like they're like, the fans are just so comfortable, which is a little off-putting at first, but now they're used to it. That's everything you guys are saying and we're talking about. That's how like the audience feels. They feel like they are friends with the host and who they're listening to. And you're right, Eric, like the market, it doesn't yet reflect that level of intense relationship.
Yeah, I'm smiling because I've had that experience where it's, this like asymmetric. I don't know this person, and this person has heard from me every week for like 80 weeks straight. It's kind of trippy. I guess like the most extreme version that I've seen, of this at scale was Smartless. I think it was an HBO or Max special on Smartless.
No, I haven't.
So Smartless is this podcast where it's Jason Bateman and two other like mega celebrities, and it's like three guys kind of talking. It's very well produced, and they did a tour. I think Max followed it and created like a 7-episode series around the tour. And when these guys would enter the stage to a packed arena, these people were just like seeing their heroes. It was pretty wild. And again, it was sort of circling around the same point, but there's something about this medium that's different and special. And I think, ultimately puts you guys with Vox in a really interesting position.
Yeah, I think it's partially about the flexibility of the medium. So I think it's great that Ryan drew the distinction between podcasts and books, because books are an example of another very deep medium, right? Like if you read someone's 300-page book, you're getting a very extensive download on what they think about things, but it's very like formal and prearranged, right? I mean, even if there are jokes in the book, they're writing about a specific topic, and like I'm learning what Scott Galloway thinks about personal finance or something like that. It's just very different from a podcast where people get to be themselves, and you'll hear them be very serious and like thought leaders and whatnot, but then you'll also hear them make silly jokes and just exude the various elements of their personality. So I think you guys are right that we haven't yet wrapped our heads around monetarily like how big of an advantage that is. And for what it's worth, and for our disproportionately ad tech audience, that's what I tell people about audio as a marketing channel is, if you're an ad tech company and let's say you create a podcast about ad ops, you might get like 100 people who regularly listen to your podcast. But if you're selling to those people, like the relationship they have with you is going to be so much deeper than, again, white papers, Twitter content, whatever it is. And all that other stuff is great. And I extol its virtues as well. But those who want to take advantage of audio as a marketing channel should not sleep on the depth of that relationship because it's very powerful.
And there is very much an attention and engagement arbitrage opportunity for brands that like can see this coming. That's how new platforms come up. And, if you were early to start marketing on TikTok, you paid lower prices and you sort of took advantage of that platform early. But now it's saturated and, you're kind of maximizing the return you're going to get, but prices have come up. But audio has not yet reached that point. So for brands that see it and can feel it and understand it, even if the ad tech isn't there to sort of put it in a spreadsheet as neatly as everyone would like, there is very much an arbitrage opportunity to sort of be an early mover at this point.
That's fascinating. That makes perfect sense. What ad tech needs to be built, Ryan, to help, you and all of the other, I think, podcast companies and creators fully realize the value?
I would say the big one is still around sort of measurement and effectiveness. I would say that's the big area that still needs a lot of development. There's other technology capabilities that still need to mature, like discovery of podcasts. It's not an ad tech related thing, but discovery is still pretty broken. Joe, you mentioned earlier, though, like the effort it takes to find a show, subscribe, download an episode, start to play it, like that doesn't necessarily need to be quite as much friction, I don't think. And if I'm going deep on a certain topic, the ability of having episodes from other shows, I might not want to listen to or subscribe to the full feed, but the ability to get those recommended. So I think that the sort of ease of discovery is another area that the medium, I think, needs to, like, has a big opportunity to sort of take advantage of.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's an opportunity to do for podcasts what, for example, like AppLovin has done for the mobile app ecosystem, right? Like giving podcast creators the opportunity to grow their audiences by advertising with other podcasters, like that kind of thing. And you see like the Vox Media Network or the Ringer Network, like these companies do a good job of using the advantage of having like dozens of podcast properties to grow each one's audience. Like there is that network effect, but it certainly seems that an ad tech company could come in and help podcasters realize that network effect across different organizations.
The piece I want to avoid from an ad tech standpoint is the commoditization of the inventory, which has happened across display and video and basically every platform that has arisen. And I am very much in a sort of existential paranoia that dynamic starts to consume audio once it becomes a big enough market to attract the attention of the sort of platforms that would start to do that. But that would spoil everything that we are talking about. And I say that not in a naive, let us enjoy our sort of small niche thing, but in a genuine, like, extol the values of what's possible in this type of medium and with this type of sort of content and engagement. That's the part that we try to avoid, the temptation of creating just commoditization of access and of the inventory and the sort of liquidity of the market, not becoming too sort of open-ended.
Are you saying ad tech ruins everything all the time?
I'm saying if misapplied.
No, I totally hear you. And I think we're all aligned. This is a special format, a special opportunity. Ryan, what can we expect coming down the pipe from Vox Media? Anything you want to plug, talk about?
Yeah, we're gonna continue to be really ambitious around growing the talent and show network. Or, as I mentioned, we just made a handful of announcements the last few weeks, and there'll be a lot more to come over the next few months and quarters. And so that's an exciting path for us. We're going to continue to grow the live event series and distribution across video networks and things like that. So it's a material part of our business. It's a growing part of our business. And in a world that is consumed with the impact from search generative experiences and the sort of pressure on the top of the funnel for publishers to reach audiences and the focus on loyalty and engagement, like this is one that we've got a leadership position, but this is one where it's a big loyalty driver.
I just want to reiterate something for our ad tech audience, which is, guys, Ryan said, hands off his precious inventory, okay? Audio SSP, it's not freaking happening. Ryan will be at the freaking entrance to that cave in armor, fending you off, okay? It's not happening to audio. These podcasters are special. They're precious. This talent will not be taken advantage of on his watch. Is that right, Ryan?
I don't know if I would go quite that far, but if anyone is interested in building the tech that can help amplify what we want, what we need, and what we want, then I'm interested in having those conversations.
Also, Ryan, who would win in a mud wrestling match between Kara Swisher and the Ringer's Bill Simmons?
Kara will not lose to anyone.
Yeah, that's probably right. All right, well, that's all I have. You have anything else, Eric?
No, I'm just getting myself up off the floor after that question. You never cease to pull one out, Joe. Appreciate you.
I do my best. Ryan, thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
Likewise. Thanks, guys.
Take care, everybody.